I just bought this $400,000 house. And he's like, you're a hairdresser. How could you possibly afford 5 houses? But she didn't need to, right? She could basically put them all on credit and with the hope of flipping them all.
With World War III possibly round the corner, rising political tensions across the board, I have the honor of having with me today Cyrus Jansen. Cyrus, thank you so much for taking the time to come to a small channel like mine. How are you doing today?
Luke, absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate you reaching out. And we connected in Malaysia and back in September, and now we get a chance to chat more. And it's my pleasure to be here. Let's jump into it.
Yeah, and there's been so much going on. It's just been kind of unbelievable. Obviously, we've had Trump that is now going to be the next president of the United States. I want to get into that with you.
Sure.
But first of all, you were actually from Canada. So you are from Vancouver. So tell us about that, because you've escaped now, and tell us about your journey.
Yeah, so actually, I'm actually from Florida, so I'm actually American, but my wife is Canadian. We were living in Vancouver, Canada for 5 years, so we loved it. It was a great time there. We did choose to leave Canada though, and I think we became a little frustrated with really the politics and the way that the country is going. Unfortunately, I think for any American viewers out there, what a lot of Americans don't realize is that unlike our American system, where every 4 years we have a set election and there's going to be a changing of the guard, in Canada there is no term limits on the prime minister, and Justin Trudeau has been ruling for over 10 years. It's sad, because I think you look at a country like Canada, it has incredible natural resources, it's an incredibly wealthy country, but it's absolutely run by some of the most irresponsible, terrible politicians that if you just simply look at it as a business, these would be the most unsuccessful CEOs, and they would get sacked. I mean, they would get fired from their job. And Trudeau's just done a very bad job. And I think what's really sad here, Luke, is, when we go back to the pandemic and you look at how that transpired, there's a lot of decisions that Trudeau made that really influenced Canada's reputation on the international stage. When his decision to freeze people's bank accounts, shut that down, invoke a new law, in many ways, it was more authoritarian than what was happening in China, a country that I lived in for 10 years. I mean, you didn't have stuff like that happening in China. And it really sent a very bad signal around the world on what's really happening in Canada. And again, it's just a missed opportunity. There's a lot of problems in Canada, and I think the Trudeau government's done a terrible job.
Yeah, and I think the power structures in Canada as well, like there's an oligarchy, like red tape and regulation stifles growth a lot. Like a lot of people, it's kind of funny, they talk about China not being a free market, but when you look at Canada, I mean, China is much more of a free market than Canada, wouldn't you agree?
100% agree with that. Absolutely.
It's kind of crazy, and I totally agree with what you said with the Freedom Convoy, the freezing of the bank accounts. I mean, as you know from what I talked about, my little time on stage, that was the turning point for me when he sent police in on his own people for a peaceful protest. I mean, that was just insane to me. That is something that you would see in a dictatorship, and he essentially turned the government into a dictatorship because he was able to just put whatever he wanted through legislation-wise without passing it through the normal democratic process, if you can even call it that. But anyways, he didn't do that. He circumvented all of that, and here we are a couple of years later. He's not behind bars, he's still in power. But anyways.
It's a tough one for us that have that connection to Canada. I mean, we certainly both enjoyed life there, and we had some good years there, but I think there's a lot of frustration going on amongst Canadians. The cost of living is through the roof. There's an absolute housing epidemic in these major cities, largely just mismanaged from poor government decisions over the years, and there needs to be a change. I think a lot of Canadians are becoming very frustrated. But, when we zoom out of Canada and we really look at it on the international stage, this is kind of a good parlay into our next segment talking about Trump. This is not surprising that Donald Trump won the election. Actually, every incumbent government in a major developed country in 2024 lost their election. So that's the first time in history, by the way. So it's the first time in history that has ever happened. Every incumbent government lost their election in 2024 and in a major developed country. And it's because there's so many world events going on right now, and the Western nations, they've got to really be careful, Luke, because this thought of, okay, democracy is the best. We're the good guys. Anybody that's not a democracy, they're the bad guys. That people don't care about that stuff anymore. At the end of the day,
No.
what's going on? How are we living our lives? Are we able to afford the life that we want to live? And people have lost trust. They've lost trust in Western democracy. They've lost trust in these governments. And across the board, you look at France, they lost the election. Macron, they look at Sunak in the UK lost. Obviously, Joe Biden and Kamala. I mean, they very much were on the same ticket. They lost. Democrats lost in a landslide. So I mean, it's people want change, and that's what we're seeing around the world. Not even just the U.S.
Totally agree with you. And what do you think, by the way, about Trump and all the tariffs? Because Trump is very obviously pro-tariffs. It's been a big part of his election, and I think as well a lot of people kind of misunderstand tariffs, especially the way he puts it as like it's going to be money coming into the country, whereas it's going to be more for the consumer and not just the US consumer, because so much trade actually goes through the US to the rest of the world. What do you kind of think of Trump's plan to implement all these tariffs? Do you even think that it's going to happen, and also its effect on the Chinese economy?
Yeah, great question. So I think what's interesting with the US is that you have to, as you know, you're doing this political campaigning. You're going to say sound bites. You're going to say things to, move the sentiment and to garner those votes. I think there is, again, kind of going back to that frustration. I think there is a frustration in America that, we are losing our manufacturing jobs, that people aren't having as many great employment opportunities here. And so, Trump has this idea, well, let's move the factories back to America. Let's bring back American jobs. Let's make America great again. All of these things are nice on paper, but it's actually very difficult to implement. And there's a problem where, I think Trump's going to have a very difficult time implementing that. When Trump started the trade war in 2018, that was not a successful trade war for the United States. 92% of those costs from the tariffs were passed on to U.S. consumers. So that's the thing that many people don't realize, is that, you want to say, well, let's tariff everything from China. Oh, okay, well, let's go through our home right now and look at all the things that come from China. And this is something I always say, our American way of life, the comforts that we enjoy, the Walmart shopping and the discount stores, and all of these things are made possible by our unique relationship with China. In addition to that, we have spent over 5 decades, 50 years, we've been doing business with China, and all of these companies, so many of the major American companies have spent decades and decades building up their factories, building up their relationships in China. It's just not as simple to do that. You can't just shut it down and then move it all back to America. It doesn't work like that. I saw a really great tweet from Mark Cuban, the billionaire investor who, owned the Dallas Mavericks NBA team for many years. He said, every company in America is patriotic. Right? If we could, we would all manufacture in America, because why wouldn't you? I mean, of course you want to, stimulate your own economy, hire American employees, have a Made in America sticker on your product. We're all patriotic. We all love the country. There's no question there. But the reality is that it's not really feasible. That's the simple reality. If they could do it, they would, but they can't because of the prices, hence why they go overseas. And so, you're going to look for opportunities to buy local. And if it makes sense, then you can do that. But if you can't, then you're going to go overseas. And that's what we're seeing with the competitive advantage of going to China. So I don't really think this is going to change much, to be honest. And the other thing that people aren't realizing is that if you're going to put a 60% tariff on Chinese goods, what happens if China retaliates and put that same 60% tariff back on you? Well, there was an interesting story that was published earlier this week where it talked about the farmland industry. And the U.S. farm industry is heavily dependent on China for exports, specifically soybean farmers and corn farmers. Now, that is the heart and soul of America. And there's a big irony here because, U.S. farmers overwhelmingly are very supportive of Republicans and definitely voted Donald Trump on the whole. And the interesting thing is they could actually become the biggest losers, because if they were to get, these tariffs, 60% tariffs slapped on them, well, then China wouldn't be buying that, and that entire industry. China has been described as an irreplaceable market for U.S. corn and soybean farmers. This is $30 billion industry. I mean, this is not a small amount of money. So, you could be talking about a lot of farmers and a huge part of the industry, completely destroyed by these. And we actually saw that in Canada, right? Remember with the canola oil farmers in Canada, right? This is when the Huawei was being restricted, and they had the whole, complete catastrophe with the whole Huawei ordeal. And the Huawei CFO was Wang Wanzhou when she was arrested under terrible conditions in Canada, where they violated her rights and all of this stuff. And it was this Canada got sandwiched between this U.S.-China controversy, and same thing. China said, well, you know what? We don't need to buy the canola oil anymore. And canola oil farmers in Canada lost tons of money. I mean, it was devastating for them. So it just more shows you, Luke. I think this is what I want people to understand, is how interconnected our economies are. All of us benefit from a global economy.
This video was powered by ExpressVPN, helping you protect your privacy with the world's fastest VPN and the VPN that I use. If you want to take advantage of my special offer, go to expressvpn.com/marketmania. Let's get back to it.
All of us benefit from working together in cooperation. And so that's something we preach on my YouTube channel, and that's something that I'm going to continue to preach for sure.
Yeah. And I'm an advocate of free markets. And one thing that I saw in Malaysia, I saw across Asia in particular, and here in Latin America, you see exactly the same thing, is Chinese vehicles are taking over. But you go to Canada and the United States, and there's a lot of tariffs on them, so much tariffs that they're practically banned, if not outright banned. And it's the same thing in many countries in Europe. Some countries, they're allowing them now. But it's really funny because when you actually think about that, and people have this stereotype of Chinese bad quality. It's not. Trust me. I've been in these vehicles. They're really high quality as any German vehicle. But it's just, who's the loser here? It's the consumer, because they're not getting that choice of buying that cheaper vehicle. Because why are they taking over in Latin America? It's because the price point. The price point is crazy. Here in Panama, Cyrus, you can get a Chinese vehicle 2024 for as much as like a 5-year-old used vehicle American car. So why would you buy the American car?
And that's the amazing thing. I mean, China is leading this green revolution. They're the largest producer of renewable energy in the world. The EV industry has completely transformed China, and now they are exporting around the world, like you said, in Africa and South America, and starting to have places in Europe. You're seeing a tremendous amount of presence of the Chinese EVs, and it's actually quite incredible because, like you said, I mean, I've been in many Chinese EVs, and they are phenomenal. The technology is amazing, and China has really cornered the market on that, because they're the only country in the world that can develop an EV battery. That's something that many people don't realize. The New York Times actually ran a great story last year that said, can the world make an EV battery without China? And you don't need to read the article. Surprise. No, the answer is no. They can't, because China owns all of the mineral processing. They own the advanced mines, all of this cobalt and nickel. All of this is being processed, in China. And so, everything, all of these steps into production are coming from China. And it's really incredible. And I think what, China has done an amazing job. I mean, even a company like Tesla, right? 55% of every Tesla in the world is coming from the Shanghai Gigafactory. There's a reason why Elon Musk is doing business in China. There's a reason why he chose Shanghai to open that Gigafactory. I mean, he certainly got, government incentives to go build it there, but it's a price point, it's a quality. And, China is not the China of the 1970s and 80s where we make cheap plastic toys. They can still do that. If they need to, they can make that, but they're also making some of the most advanced, equipment and technology in the world. Companies are going to China because of that. And that's a competitive advantage that China has.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And Huawei as well is like, you see especially with solar, like solar is like half or a third of the cost of what it would be in the United States and Canada, because we're able to source Huawei batteries here, which are super, super inexpensive compared to like the Tesla charging kits for your house. Those are massively, massively expensive. So yeah, it's just kind of crazy to me that people think, oh, let's close the door on China. It's almost impossible to do that without essentially starving yourself off of goods and all the rest of it.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and what's funny is you look at the United States, and China, and how they both approach a continent like Africa. In the United States, they primarily go to Africa and they say, you should not be doing business with China. You should be doing business with us. And yeah, sure, every African country would love to do business with the U.S. But when it comes to actually improving the logistics and the infrastructure of Africa, there's no country in the world that's doing a better job than China. China. We'll go to the simple example of the 4G network in all of Africa. Like you mentioned, the company you just mentioned, Huawei, they've made about 60% of that entire 4G network throughout the continent is made by Huawei. So,
Wow.
you want us to stop doing business with China, but wait, the country that actually is responsible for our 4G network in the continent is actually China. And it's actually Huawei, who's one of the top telecommunication companies in the world and has incredible reach, all over the world. Very popular phones and very popular services in Africa, throughout Asia, obviously China, South America. But again, like you said, it's that U.S. consumer. We can't buy, U.S. Canadians, we can't buy Huawei. We're not allowed to buy Huawei phones here, but they're great technology. And it's a truly incredible company, actually.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And do you think there's actually any incentive there for like China? Because people say it all the time. Like if you were to buy a Chinese phone, for example, people are going to say, well, they're spying on you. But is there actually any truth, or is there actually any incentive for China to actually do that?
I always find it really funny when people use that as an example. And I kind of counter it this way. I'm like, how arrogant are you that you think China's government is interested in spying on, even you, Luke, or myself? Like, do you think that they honestly are going to just be spying on random citizens? And for what purpose? What are they going to do with the data? It's the same thing with TikTok. The whole TikTok is a tool used by the Communist Party. So that they can take video, they can see you doing your lip singing and doing your funny dance videos, and they're going to use that as intelligence, and what they're going to plan an attack on America. So much of it is fear mongering, and that is unfortunately, my country leads the world in that. In the United States, I saw a tweet from a Republican senator. I forgot the name of the gentleman, but he had sent, we have over 400,000 Chinese students that are studying in our university system. Most of them are kind and nice, but at any moment, any one of them could be asked by the CCP to spy for their government, and unfortunately, they have no other option but to comply. And I'm like, there's no evidence of this at all. This is complete sensationalism. It's complete nonsense, because all you're doing by sending out that tweet is you now are installing fear in amongst the American people. And how do you think people are now going to look at when it's like, oh yeah, I want you to meet this person, they're a Chinese student, studying at the university. So you're are you spying on us? Are you doing this? No, I mean, come on, let's just be more rational. Stuff like that is just completely has no place in our society, especially in the United States and Canada, where our two nations, very much are built on immigration. They're built on immigration. They're built on welcoming in best and brightest minds from around the world. And it's a really sad state when you see, unfortunately, high elected government officials tweeting and spreading this absolute nonsense.
I totally agree with you. And one thing that you will obviously know this, and I'm so interested to know and dive into this, is how do people in China, how do they see the United States and Canada? Because we always hear about how Americans and Canadians see China, but how do they see us?
I think what's amazing is that you would hear this from Chinese people, is that, and I'll speak specifically on the United States, because Canada, is a very small country. So I would say actually for most Chinese, they'll kind of look at Canada and the U.S. They would say tapadola, it's just like kind of more or less the same. It's like Canada basically follows the U.S. You guys are pretty much the same thing. So with the U.S. specifically, I would always say this, is that Chinese people love American culture. They love American people. They are very curious. I wouldn't say that they're big fans of the American government, but I would say that they actually like all of the they can separate the people from the government. And I say, that's interesting, because that would be a great philosophy for a lot of Americans. I'm not here to tell you that China's government's amazing, nor do I want you to, I could care less if you hate communism. If you hate communism, you hate the Chinese government, that's fine. But you need to separate the Chinese government from the people and realize that they're two different things, and that China is filled with wonderful people, a great culture, a great history. And, Chinese people, whenever I'm in China, I've been traveling to China for over 17 years. I have not had a single bad experience being an American in China. I'm a very tall, Caucasian man. I'm 6'4", big guy, blue eyes, and I stick out in China. And people will always come up and ask me, where are you from? Where are you from? And when I say America or the United States, they always smile. It's like, oh, America, great. I want, and they're very knowledgeable. I mean, Chinese people were following the U.S. election. I mean, they're very curious, as with the rest of the world, to see, how is this election going to go? Yeah, I think Chinese people are much more rational as well. I mean, I don't think they're looking at the United States democracy and saying, oh my gosh, I wish we could vote for our leader. They've got a different system. They have a different system, a different government, a different way of life. And it's not to say that one is better than the other. I think that there's advantages to both systems. I've lived in both systems. I've enjoyed both systems. And I think there's advantages and disadvantages to both of them. So it's, every country has to figure out what is best for them and their people. And I think the United States and China are both working on that, as every country in the world is, but it's really important.
I mean, it's kind of crazy as well, because when you think about it, if you were to say, oh, Dubai and Abu Dhabi and these places, they're absolute monarchies, and nobody ever talks about that. But when it comes to China, it's always about the political side of things. And I think a lot of this is just the news and the media that drums this up and gains a lot of. How is the Chinese economy? And I also wanted to ask you, like, it kind of segues into this as well, is about the real estate collapse in China, because there's been all kinds of articles about it in Western media, but we don't really know from the outside looking in what's going on. You might have a different view.
Yeah, I think what I want to kind of bring a different perspective here, because I want people to understand a little bit more about the history. So, when I first went to China in 2007, China's GDP grew by 14% that year in 2007. I mean, that was a breakout year for growth. I believe 2008 was, probably about 12 or 13%. So, I mean, you had this huge GDP growth, and, China at that time was booming. I mean, it was absolutely booming. There was probably no better place in the world to be. Certainly myself in my young 20s, starting my career, like, wow, I mean, you're in an amazing part of the world that is growing rapidly, and almost every industry was just booming. And so, as being in finance, you can grow by 14%, when you're a certain size. But after growing 14% and then 12, and then every year you're having this double-digit growth, well, the Chinese economy is much larger today in 2024 than it was in 2007 and 8. It's tremendous, and it's a huge increase because China has gotten wealthier. China has gotten much bigger, and what we're seeing now is a shift of the phase, right? The high growth days is over, because China is not a developing nation anymore. In many ways they still are developing, but they're not in that early stage of that cycle, is what I'm trying to get at. And so I'll give you an example. I bought a house in Shanghai. I bought an apartment, 2-bedroom apartment in Shanghai in 2009, and I sold that 6 years later, and sold it for about a 400% increase, within about 6 years. And that was a very common return. And I remember back in 2009, I had a client of mine who was in real estate, and I was making this was my first purchase of any house, and it was my first house purchase, home ownership of anywhere in the world, and ironically, it was in Shanghai, China. And I was a little nervous because I'm like, gosh, I don't, is this a safe investment? Do you think my investment will go up? And I remember him thinking, man, it's China, like it's Shanghai, like there's only one way it's going. It's only going up. Like you literally cannot lose on this investment. Buy it today, and just don't wait. Like just do it. Like, you don't even need to think about it. Just buy it and watch it go up. And, and I also was going to live in it as well. So I'm like, oh, at least I get a place to live as well. So I bought it, lived in my apartment for, 5 years. Again, every year was going up in value. Eventually we left China and I moved to Hong Kong, and I said, it's up quite a bit, maybe I can hold it longer and get even more returns, but why be greedy? You've got a four banger, a 400% increase, take some profit and, get out. I'm glad I did. And so what's happened is that you're now seeing, as you can imagine, during that rapid rise of appreciation, there was a lot of real estate investors that got involved. A lot of people wanted to flip places. A lot of people started buying as much properties as they could. Developers got very greedy. They started overextending themselves. You've probably heard of Evergrande facing bankruptcy, and it's like, holy smokes, we are borrowing so much money, and we are so over leveraged in everything that it is really, really difficult right now. And so there's a couple of things I want people to understand. Number one, what we're seeing in China is a maturity. We're seeing that those days of the 100% increases in a 12-month span, those are gone. Those will not happen again anytime soon. And I think what's happening is that the Chinese government came out and they said, we don't want you to buy houses for speculation. We want you to buy a house to live in, and we want you to make sure that, there's too much of this speculation going around. China got ahead of the Evergrande fiasco because they're not going to let them go into bankruptcy and fail on these apartments. And there was some projects, for example, that we have to also understand for the Chinese cultural element is that owning a house is really everything in China. So it's not uncommon, for example, for in Chinese culture, if you want to marry a woman, you need to have a house. Okay, so if you and I are bachelors and we wanted to get a Chinese wife, we need to get a house, right? You have to own a house or have a property that you can ask that woman to marry you because you're building a family, right? You can't just come empty-handed and say, "Hey, I want to marry you." In China, the culture, it's all about logistics. Well, do you have a house? How are you going to provide for my daughter? How are you going to raise a family? How are you going to have kids? What's your plan? It's much more about logistics. So that in Chinese culture is very important. You have to have a house. So, because of the price of housing, it's not uncommon for, let's say the wife's parents, the husband's parents, the grandparents, these grandparents, kind of everybody pull some money together and let's buy a house together. That way, you guys have a place to stay. So, it's a big investment. And when these real estate companies were getting overextended, a lot of these projects were put on hold. And all of a sudden it's like, well, you put a deposit down, but we're not able to finish this project. And now families are like, well, geez, we don't have another option here. Like, we need to get this apartment. So the government has come in, and I know a few case stories from some friends that had bought apartments. Their apartment was put on hold for 6 months, and then all of a sudden the Chinese government came in and it's like, okay, we need to finish these projects. We need to make sure that the people are going to get the house that they ordered, because if we don't, then it's going to be a huge problem. So I guess what I'm really trying to go back to here, Luke, is that in 2008 and 9, we had a global financial crisis. What was the cause of that? It was the housing collapse inside the United States. This is not uncommon for major economies to go through a housing correction. And actually, when I went back to China this summer, I was talking about real estate. There was actually some optimism from a lot of people because they're like, hey, housing prices are down 20 or 30%. Well, that's actually great because maybe we can afford one now. Like it's actually become 20 to 30% more affordable for us, that we actually potentially have a chance to buy one of these houses. And again, we're not going to buy to speculate. We're not going to buy, hoping that this will double in 2 years' time. We're going to buy because we need a place to live. And that's what we want to do. And the other thing that's really interesting is that in China, the requirements to own a house are much, much more strict. You have to put a very large deposit down, and the amount of equity that Chinese people own in their house is substantially more than what we have in the United States. So I remember back in 2008 and 9, I mean, you could buy a house with 0% down, like zero down, zero down, get a house. Yeah. And I remember my father, it was really funny. He's in construction, and he was got called over for a quote, and the lady was she was a hairdresser, and she's just like, yeah, I've just bought my 5th house. And he's like, I'm sorry? She's like, yeah, like all the houses are going up, I'm just buying as many as I can. 0%, zero down, 0% interest for the first 6 months. Like, I'm just I just bought this $400,000 house. And he's like, you're a hairdresser, how could you possibly afford 5 houses? But she didn't need to, right? She could basically put them all on credit, and with the hope of flipping them all. And of course, as soon as I remember him calling me and saying, we're going to have a massive housing meltdown here in Florida. Like, this is in Florida, my home state. He said, this is going to be absolute catastrophe. And it was. And eventually, this woman would have lost all those in a bankruptcy. She wouldn't be able to afford those mortgages, and she would have 100% filed a bankruptcy and foreclosed on all those properties.
Wow, that was crazy time.
It was.
And I think one thing I want to ask you about as well, you said about the Chinese economy slowing down in terms of growth. Obviously, I would say that the West benefited a lot of the Chinese expansion at the time where it was expanding, like post 2008, when every Western economy was suffering. So with the Chinese economy, the growth slowing down, and this saying, like, if the US sneezes, the world catches a cold. Well, China's economy is so big now, like, arguably it could be the biggest economy or the second largest economy in the world. So with the Chinese growth slowing, how will that impact the rest of the world? This is the end of part 1. If you want to watch part 2, then subscribe to the channel or check out the podcast channel. Check it out in the links in the description below. I will see you